Gardaí called on O'Donnell to surrender, but he grabbed the woman with the rifle to her head and threatened to blow her head off.
Young woman and son were ritually slain. Imelda was shot in the left eye socket and her 3-year-old son in the left side of the head. Their bodies, he said, were found intertwined in a County Clare wood. The body of a priest, Fr Joe Walsh, was found nearby and he was shot in the head.
This story was hard to break down, but I got there in the end. There were statements from the family, friends, witnesses, Gardaí, doctors and the killer himself. There were truth, lies, facts, abuse and neglect. But what can't be denied is 3 innocent people were murdered in cold blood. But as always, I will let you decide for yourself by giving you as much detail as possible. Unlike my other videos, I have to concentrate on the killer, as there is not a lot of information about the victims. As quoted by author Patrick Butler, which rings through to me, if the families of the victims of crimes like this don't speak, then it becomes the story of the killer. If people choose to be silent, the story of the victim will never be told, and the pain of their families is extinguished. Today we are in the village of Whitegate, County Clare. It's situated close to Lough Derg. Lough Derg is the 3rd biggest freshwater lake situated in the Shannon River Basin in Ireland. It is a long, narrow lake with shores in counties Clare, Galway and Tipperary. And before you all start shouting at me, yes, I know there is a second, much smaller Lough Derg in County Donegal. Brendan O'Donnell was from Whitegate and suffered psychiatric problems from a young age. When he was 4, he was put on Valium, which would give him really bad nightmares. He would see things in his room that weren't there. He would wet the bed and he thought there was worms in his food. Brendan was very close to his mother, but she suffered from severe depression and on occasion had to be hospitalised. And every time she was admitted for treatment, he felt abandoned. He was also unfortunate on one occasion to witness his mother trying to take her own life. Brendan's father was a bit of a drinker, was extremely violent towards him. He would beat him often with a poker, hurley or have his head bashed against a wall. Often his sister Anne-Marie, who was 4 years older than Brendan, would have to rescue him from his father as the beatings were so bad. In 1984, Brendan's mother would pass away from a fall, and Brendan would take this loss very badly. He went into a powerful denial. When they had the wake with an open coffin, Brendan stood beside it and kept saying, "That's not my mam." When they were burying her, he thought she was being buried alive. He was 10 years of age at the time. Afterwards, he would go out at night and sleep on her grave. After their mother died, Anne-Marie would move home to look after her younger brothers. She had been living with her grandmother from the age of 6 and now she was 14. Brendan got into trouble a lot after his mother died, stealing, breaking into houses, and people were afraid of him. He definitely had respect in the village, but it was through fear. His first chargeable offence was when he broke into a house and took a gun. He held his sister and her friends captive in their house. He was sent to a Young Offenders Institute, Trinity House in Dublin. This is where things would turn even darker for Brendan. He claimed he was raped by one of the wardens there, but felt too ashamed to tell his family. He was 15 years old. Brendan would run away from Trinity House in Dublin and he'd be dropped right back by his father, who wanted nothing to do with him. One time they drove him there, and by the time they got back to Clare, a 200-kilometre journey, Brendan was home before them, standing in the yard. The last time he ran away from Trinity House, he ended up sleeping rough in Craigwood, just outside Whitegate. He had no food, no shelter and no warmth. On a particular bad night, weather-wise, he would turn up at the house of Tony Mugavin and his family. Tony was second cousin to Brendan's family, but they wouldn't have been close. Tony would take him under his wing and try and get him help. He took him in that night and gave him food and clean clothes. Brendan told him he was on the run from Trinity House and there was no way he was going back there. He told Tony about the sexual abuse and not feeling right in the head, and would Tony help him. Tony hid him from the guards until he could get him some help. Tony withdrew money from his bank the next day and was willing to pay the psychiatric hospital to take Brendan in. He was refused in 2 places, and the third, Brendan's father, wouldn't sign the papers to have him admitted. Tony contacted his solicitor and got custody of Brendan in court, which in turn saved him from going back to Trinity House. Tony kept Brendan in his home and continued to try and get him help. Brendan had good weeks and bad weeks, but because he was going untreated, it became next to impossible to keep him in his home. For the safety of his own family, he had to let him go. Brendan then moved on to his grandmother's house in Aircourt, County Galway, and stayed with her for 3 weeks. But again it became too much for her, as Brendan now began to suffer from auditory and visual hallucinations. In 1989, Brendan's father remarried and had another son. In 1992, his sister Anne-Marie, who had her own child, was living in a flat in Portumna, County Galway. Brendan lived in the same block of flats. One day he called to Anne-Marie and asked her to make him a sandwich. Because she said in a minute, he got extremely agitated and attacked her with a knife. He went to stab her in the chest, but stabbed her in the knee instead. Brendan was put in a psychiatric hospital and kept there for 2 weeks. He had told the Garda that Anne-Marie was a raving lunatic who was trying to poison him. When he came out of hospital, Anne-Marie said he was in a worse state. In the spring of 1993, Brendan went to England and got into trouble again and was arrested. In 1994, he skipped bail and returned to Ireland and to Whitegate. Brendan was now 20 years of age, having spent 80% of his teenage years in detention centres, prisons and psychiatric hospitals. He was back living rough in Craigwoods. Imelda Riney was born and raised in Terranure, a middle-class area of Dublin. She was an artist mainly working with glass and mosaic. She lived with her husband Val Balance in the UK with her 2 children. After the breakdown of their marriage in 1992, Imelda moved back to Ireland with her 2 sons, Oisín and Liam, and bought an old cottage on the outskirts of Whitegate. Despite the breakdown of the marriage, Imelda and Val remained on good terms, and he would often visit her and the children. On the 24th of April 1994, Val was back visiting in Ireland. 5 days later, on the 29th of April, he took on a small job that needed doing at the local school. He dropped Oisín 7 to a neighbour's house, leaving Imelda 29 and Liam 3 alone at the house. Imelda was to visit him at the job later that day, but never arrived. On a side note, you all know I love my side notes. I wanted to explain the dynamics of a small village mentality within Ireland at the time, including the village Whitegate. This is nothing against the people and the guards, but it did play a part in what was to happen. We have what we call blow-ins here in Ireland. If you weren't born and raised in the village or a particular area, well then you were an outsider. So in the Whitegate community you had 2 parts, the locals and then the people that came to live an alternative lifestyle after escaping the rat race. They coexisted just fine and didn't put in on each other. The locals would see them as hippie artists and free spirits that would come and go and no concern would be shown. Whereas if a local was to go missing, the response would be immediate. Returning home, Val found the gas cooker to be still on and Imelda's tobacco pouch on the countertop, but no sign of Imelda or their son Liam. He waited until the next day to report her missing, which was Saturday the 30th of April. The Gardaí didn't show any concern and said she was probably gone off for a few days. Meanwhile in Craigwood, just outside Whitegate, on the same day, a car was found burnt out with the number plates gone, so the car could not be identified. It wasn't until Tuesday the 3rd of May that the media heard Imelda and Liam were missing. They were contacted by Val with the photograph of Imelda and Liam, and people finally started to take note. Even the locals were starting to talk and make a connection between the burnt out car in Craigwoods, Imelda and Liam and Brendan O'Donnell, but still the Gardaí were not overly concerned.
One person said that they saw her car travelling out of Whitegate, travelling north, which is not a direction that she would have been expected to take for any reason, and that there was someone else in the car at that time.
How worried are you now about her?
I'm desperately worried, of course, I'm desperately worried.
On Tuesday night, Fr Joe Walsh went missing from his home in Aircourt, County Galway. 40 kilometres away from Whitegate. The next day, Wednesday the 4th of May, another car was found burnt out at Williamstown Pier, just a few miles from Imelda's home. It was identified as Father Joe's car. The Gardaí still didn't connect the dots. 3 people now missing, and they were only searching for Father Joe. It wasn't until the Saturday the 7th of May that the first burnt out car in Craigwood was identified as Imelda's. 8 days after Imelda and Liam went missing, the Gardaí finally put a full search and rescue in place for all 3. Their main suspect was Brendan O'Donnell, and his face was plastered all over the newspapers. They appealed for Brendan to turn himself in. The full force of Clare Gardaí were out looking for Imelda, Liam, Father Joe and Brendan, with helicopters and armed forces combing the area of Whitegate. Brendan knew the Gardaí were hot on his heels. He broke into a house and kidnapped a 17-year-old girl, Fiona Sampson, making her drive him out of the area. On the road, she lost control and crashed the car. The helicopter spotted the car, and at the same time a local farmer, Eddie Cleary, had stopped, and Brendan tried to hijack his car, but the man very bravely managed to take the gun from Brendan as it went off, blowing a hole in the roof of the car. The Gardaí arrived on the scene and Brendan was put on the ground and handcuffed. Fiona was unharmed and was taken to hospital and treated for shock, as was Mr. Cleary. Now that Brendan was in custody, the search continued to find Imelda, Liam and Father Joe. On Saturday evening, Father Joe would be the first to be found in Craigwood. He was found above ground with 1 shot to the back of the head, execution style. The next day, Sunday the 8th of May, Imelda and Liam were found together in a shallow grave 20 feet from where Father Joe was found. Imelda was shot in the eye at point blank range, and poor little Liam had been shot in the left side of his head. All the bodies were brought to Ennis General Hospital, and after their post-mortems the bodies were released to the families. Father Joe's funeral took place in Aircourt Village, and there was a massive turnout for his funeral. Imelda and Liam were brought to Whitegate Church for the funeral. Hundreds of people turned out, and it was the saddest thing to see Liam's little white coffin beside his mother's. The children from the local primary school made a guard of honour to honour their little friend that they never got to meet.
Unprecedented scenes of grief and loss have marked the funeral services for Aircourt curate Fr Joe Walsh today.
People from the villages of Whitegate and Mount Shannon watched in stunned silence as the hearse carrying the coffins of Imelda Riney and her 3-year-old son Liam made their way to St Flannan's Church.
Another reason for mourning is the shattering realisation that evil can stalk the land even in this quiet and beautiful place.
Before Brendan could stand trial, an extensive psychiatric evaluation had to be done to see if he was actually fit to stand trial. The yardstick to decide this boils down to 3 main questions. Did he know what he was doing? If he did know what he was doing, was he aware that it was wrong? Even if the answer to these 2 questions is yes, would he have been able to stop himself from carrying it out? That is, had he irresistible impulse? Brendan was deemed fit for trial, and on January the 5th, 1996, he appeared at the Central Criminal Court in Dublin, charged with the murders of Imelda, Liam and Father Joe. He pleaded not guilty. During the trial, Brendan could not attend every day as he was so unfit. The wardens were overheard saying that when Brendan was due in court, he was brought from the mental hospital in Dundrum to Mountjoy Prison, to the court and then back to the mental hospital. If he was so fit to stand trial, why was he in the mental hospital? He tried to commit suicide during the time of the trial, and it had to be delayed. On the 53rd day, the jury found him guilty of the 3 murders, and he was handed down 3 life sentences. He was brought straight to Mountjoy Prison and then to Arbour Hill Prison, where he attacked a fellow inmate and was transferred to the Central Mental Hospital. The sequence of events obviously came out during the trial. On Friday the 29th of April, Brendan went to Imelda's house where she was with Liam. Brendan had a gun with him which he had stolen from a house that he had broken into that day. When he arrived at Imelda's, he told her he needed her to be his getaway driver, as he was going to rob the post office in Whitegate. But before they left the house, Brendan raped her and claimed he was in a relationship, and it was consensual, but the post-mortem would state differently. He also claimed they were in love, but also killed her because she was the devil's daughter. He forced Imelda and her son into the car and they drove towards Whitegate. They were seen that day by locals and Imelda was signalling that she was in trouble, but no one copped it and it wasn't reported to the Gardaí until the following Wednesday after Imelda went missing. Brendan copped it though and made Imelda drive to Craigwood instead, where he walked Imelda and Liam to their deaths. Imelda struggled for the gun and it went off, shooting her in the eye. Brendan said Liam didn't see it happen as he was a few feet away from her, but I don't know how true this is. Brendan said he didn't want Liam to grow up without a mother like he had, so he shot Liam and buried them together in a shallow grave. Obviously Brendan didn't think of her other son growing up without a mother. Brendan then went back to Imelda's car, took the license plate off and set it alight. When the Tuesday came around, Brendan went to his grandmother's in Ayr Court and she made him something to eat. He then arrived at Father Joe's around midnight and held him captive for hours. Father Joe was trying to talk him down and offered him money and his watch that his sister had given him, but Brendan wasn't having any of it. He made Father Joe drive them to Craigwood, to the area he had already taken Imelda and Liam's life. Father Joe told him he could take his life as long as he didn't hurt anyone else. Brendan told Father Joe that he had to die, as to stop him from christening the devil's son. He knelt Father Joe down, stood behind him and shot him in the back of the head, and he died instantly. Brendan then drove Father Joe's car to Williamstown Pier and set it alight. Locals reported seeing Brendan driving the car, and this is how they connected Brendan to Father Joe being missing. A few days later, Brendan went to a house and kidnapped Fiona Sampson and tried to hijack Eddie Cleary's car that led to his capture. Brendan's teacher from primary school described in court that he was the most disturbed child he ever came across in his 22 years of teaching. Patrick McKee for the defence highlighted the virtual hell that had been his life, and with some understatement described him as a badly damaged creature. The prosecution described Brendan as cunning, thinking rational, a clever, self-interested liar. Brendan was a year into his sentence, still in the mental hospital, and he deteriorated quite rapidly, physically and psychologically. His friends and family that visited him said he was not the man he used to be. On the 24th of July 1997, Brendan was found in his cell, non-responsive. He was transferred to St. Vincent's Hospital and was pronounced dead less than an hour later.
Good evening. A post-mortem is to be carried out to establish the cause of death of the triple killer Brendan O'Donnell, whose body was discovered in a cell at Dublin's Central Mental Hospital in Dundrum this morning.
It was told at the inquest into his death that Brendan, the self-confessed son of Satan, expressed deep remorse for his wicked crimes days before his death. He said he felt extremely sad and sorrowful over the deaths of Imelda, Liam and Father Joe. Psychiatrist Dr. Charles Smith told the inquest that the killer had died a depressed and broken man. He claimed he was constantly at war with himself and he was always trying to harm himself, the jury heard. Dr. Smith said Brendan was one of the most complex, troubled patients he had known. He went on hunger strike and attacked himself numerous times. A few days before his death, he smashed his hand through a glass pane. The state pathologist Dr. John Harbison said he believed Brendan died from a fatal intoxication of a tranquilizer called Meloril. Small amounts of the drug that can cause heart failure was given to Brendan. So basically Brendan died of a heart attack after suffering an adverse reaction to the drug. The The jury of 4 men and 4 women returned the verdict of death by misadventure. To say the people of Whitegate were relieved that Brendan was dead and would never be returning there is an understatement, but I don't think I need to go into the exact quotes as it doesn't serve anyone. As of 2022, it's been 28 years since this terrible tragedy. Fiona Sampson, the 17-year-old that was kidnapped by Brendan, became a nurse. Imelda's son, Oisin, followed in his mother's footsteps and became a very successful artist. Unfortunately, Imelda's sister was to pass away on May the 1st, 2012. She died from asphyxia after she collapsed while drinking. There has been a lot of opinions of this case over the years, how the health system failed Brendan from a very young age, the circumstances that he grew up in, and the people that tried to help him, failing to no fault of their own. How the Gardaí failed to take Imelda and Liam going missing seriously. Not that they could have saved them, but they could have found them earlier, and it may have saved Father Joe's life. I have read that a book has been written about the sequence of events. It has been written by Edna O'Brien and has caused outrage among the families of the victims and the community of Whitegate. She has been accused of gross insensitivity and exploiting grief, intrusive and sensationalising the events. Edna O'Brien, being from the area of Clare, has justified the book for that reason. I have not read it myself, and I won't be, as it was harrowing enough to go through the facts of the case without reading something that has legs put on it. I will let you, as always, have your own opinion on the story. It was a terrible tragedy, so many lives lost, it will never be forgotten. While Brendan's mental illness absolved him to a degree because of his history and the state he was in, what sometimes happens is that the public demand a scapegoat to bring justice to the people that died and to put an end to the heinous crime that happened and to say the killer is caught and behind bars and we have our safe little community back again. Basically, someone has to pay.
I still get angry. And I think while I live, I will always be angry at the mental health professionals. It's their job to treat the sick people, and they failed. They failed from day one. And then I look at what Brendan did. A young mother, working to make a home for her 2 children. A young priest, and a young baby, dead. And then I think Brendan died shortly afterwards. And we say, you know, listen, lessons can be learned. When are these lessons going to be learned?